Walking home that Sunday evening, Miro couldn't stop thinking about Zagreus. But as he walked up the stairs to his room, he heard groans coming from the barrel maker Cardona's apartment. He knocked. No one answered, but the groans continued, and Miro walked right in. The barrel maker was huddled on his bed, sobbing like a child. At his feet was the photograph of an old woman. "She's dead," Cardona gasped. It was true, but it had happened a long time ago. Cardona was deaf, half dumb, a mean and violent man. Until recently he had lived with his sister, but his tyranny had at last exhausted the woman, and she had taken refuge with her children, and he had remained alone, as helpless as a man can be, who must cook and clean for himself, for the first time in his life. His sister had described their quarrels to Miro one day when she had met him in the street. Cardona was 30, short, rather handsome. Since childhood he had lived with his mother, the only human being ever to inspire him with fear, superstitious rather than justified, moreover. He had loved her with all his uncouth heart, which is to say both harshly and eagerly. And the best proof of his affection was his way of teasing the old woman by mouthing, with difficulty, the worst abuse of priests and the church. If he had lived so long with his mother, it was also because he had never induced any other woman to care for him. Infrequent pickups in a brothel authorized him, however, to call himself a man. The mother died. From then on, he had lived with his sister. Miro rented them the room they occupied. Each quite solitary, they struggled through a long, dark, dirty life. They found it hard to speak to each other. They went for days without a word. But now she had left. He was too proud to complain, to ask her to come back. He lived alone. Mornings, he ate in the restaurant downstairs, evenings up in his room bringing food from a charcuterie. He washed his own sheets, his overalls, but he left his room utterly filthy. Sometimes, though, soon after the sister had left him, he would start his Sundays by taking a rag and trying to clean up the place. But his man's clumsiness, a saucepan on the mantelpiece that had once been decorated with vases and figurines, showed up in the neglect in which everything was left. What he called putting things in order consisted of hiding the disorder, pushing dirty clothes behind cushions, or arranging the most disparate objects on the sideboard. Finally, he tired of making the effort, no longer bothered to make his bed, and slept with his dog on the fetid blankets. His sister had said to Miro, "He carries on in the cafe, but the woman in the laundry told me she saw him crying when he had to wash his own sheets." And it was a fact that, hardened as he was, a terror seized this man at certain times and forced him to acknowledge the extent of his desolation. Of course, the sister had lived with him out of pity, she had told Miro, but Cardona kept her from seeing the man she loved. At their age, though, it didn't matter much anymore. Her boyfriend was a married man. He brought her flowers he had picked in the suburban hedgerows, oranges, and tiny bottles of liqueur he had won at shooting galleries. Not that he was handsome or anything, but you can't eat good looks for dinner, and he was so decent. She valued him, and he valued her. Wasn't that love? She did his laundry for him and tried to keep things nice. He used to wear a handkerchief folded in a triangle and knotted around his neck. She made his handkerchiefs very white, and that was one of his pleasures. But her brother wouldn't let him come to the house. She had to see him on the sly. Once she had let him come, and her brother had caught them, and there had been a terrible brawl. The handkerchief folded in a triangle had been left behind in a filthy corner of the room, and she had taken refuge with her son. Miro thought of that handkerchief as he stared around the sordid room. Now, as whenever he found himself confronting a brutal manifestation of life, Miro was powerless, filled with respect for that animal pain. He sat down on the dirty, rumpled blankets and laid one hand on Cardona's shoulder. In front of him, on the oilcloth covering the table, was an oil lamp, a bottle of wine, crusts of bread, a piece of cheese, and a toolbox. In the corners of the ceiling, festoons of cobwebs. Miro, who had never been in this room since his own mother's death, measured the distance this man had traveled by the desolation around him. The window overlooking the courtyard was closed. The other window was open only a crack. The oil lamp in a fixture surrounded by a tiny deck of china cards cast its calm circle of light on the table, on Meursault, and Cardona's feet, and on a chair facing them. Meanwhile, Cardona had picked up the photograph and was staring at it, kissing it, mumbling, "Poor maman." But it was himself he was pitying. She was buried in the hideous cemetery Meursault knew well, on the other side of town. He wanted to leave. Speaking slowly to make himself understood, he said, "You can't stay here, like this." "No more work," Cardona gasped, and holding out the photograph, he stammered, "I loved her, I loved her." And Meursault translated, "She loved me." "She's dead," and Meursault understood. "I'm alone. I made her that for her last birthday." On the mantelpiece was a tiny wooden barrel with brass hoops and a shiny spigot. Meursault let go of Cardona's shoulder, and he collapsed on the dirty pillows. From under the bed came a deep sigh and a sickening smell. The dog dragged itself out, flattening its rump, and rested its head on Meursault's lap, its long ears pricked up, its golden eyes staring into his own. Meursault looked at the little barrel. In the miserable room, where there was scarcely enough air to breathe, with the dog's warmth under his ringers, he closed his eyes on the despair that rose within him like a tide for the first time in a long while. Today, in the face of abjection and solitude, his heart said, "No." And in the great distress that washed over him, Meursault realized that his rebellion was the only authentic thing in him, and that everything else was misery and submission. The street that had been so animated under his windows the day before still swelled with life. From the gardens beyond the courtyard rose a smell of grass. Meursault offered Cardona a cigarette, and both men smoked without speaking. The last streetcars passed, and with them the still vivid memories of men and lights. Cardona fell asleep and soon began snoring, his nose stuffed with tears. The dog, curling up at Meursault's feet, stirred occasionally and moaned in its dreams. Each time it moved, its smell reached Meursault, who was leaning against the wall, trying to choke down the rebellion in his heart. The lamp smoked, charred, and finally went out with a stink of oil. Meursault dozed off and awakened with his eyes fixed on the bottle of wine. Making a tremendous effort, he stood up, walked over to the rear window, and stood there. Out of the night's heart sounds and silences mounted toward him. At the limits of this sleeping world, a long blast from a ship summoned men to depart, to begin again. The next morning, Meursault killed Zagros, came home, and slept all afternoon. He awakened in a fever. That evening, still in bed, he sent for the neighborhood doctor, who told him he had grippe. A man from his office, who had come to find out what was the matter, took Meursault's resignation to Monsieur Langlois. A few days later, everything was settled. An article in the newspaper, an investigation. There was every motive for Zagros's action. Martha came to see Meursault and said with a sigh, "Sometimes there are days when you'd like to change places with him. But sometimes it takes more courage to live than to shoot yourself." A week later, Meursault boarded a ship for Marseille. He told everyone he was going to France for a rest. From Lyons, Martha received a letter of farewell from which only her pride suffered. In the same letter, Meursault said he had been offered an exceptional job in Central Europe. Martha wrote him at a general delivery address about how much she was suffering. Her letter never reached Meursault, who had a violent attack of fever the day after he reached Lyons and took the first train for Prague. As it happened, Martha told him that, after several days in the morgue, Zagros had been buried and that it had taken a lot of pillows to wedge his body into the coffin. Part 2. Conscious death. "I'd like a room," the man said in German. The clerk was sitting in front of a board covered with keys and was separated from the lobby by a broad table. He stared at the man who had just come in, a gray raincoat over his shoulders, and who spoke with his head turned away. "Certainly, sir. For one night?" "No, I don't know. We have rooms at 18, 25, and 30 crowns. Meursault looked through the glass door of the hotel out into the little Prague street, his hands in his pockets, his hair rumpled. Not far away, he could hear the streetcars screeching down the Avenue Wenceslas. "Which room would you like, sir?" "It doesn't matter," Meursault said, still staring through the glass door. The clerk took a key off the rack and handed it to Meursault. "Room number 12, he said. Meursault seemed to wake up. "How much is this room?" 30 crowns. "That's too much. Give me a room for 18. Without a word, the man took another key off the rack and indicated the brass star attached to it. Room number 34. Sitting in his room, Meursault took off his jacket, loosened his tie, and mechanically rolled up his shirt sleeves. He walked over to the mirror above the sink, meeting a drawn face slightly tanned where it was not darkened by several days' growth of beard. His hair fell in a tangle over his forehead, down to the 2 deep creases between his eyebrows, which gave him a grave, tender expression, he realized. Only then did he think of looking around this miserable room, which was all the comfort he had, and beyond which he envisioned nothing at all. On a sickening carpet, huge yellow flowers against a gray background, a whole geography of filth, suggested a grimy universe of wretchedness. Behind the huge radiator, clots of dust. The regulator was broken, and the brass contact points were exposed. Over the sagging bed dangled a fly-specked wire, at its end a sticky light bulb. Meursault inspected the sheets, which were clean. He took his toilet things out of the overnight bag and arranged them one by one on the sink. Then he started to wash his hands, but turned off the tap and walked over to open the uncurtained window. It overlooked a courtyard with a washing trough and a series of tiny windows in the walls. Laundry was drying on a cord stretched between 2 of them. Meursault lay down on the bed and fell asleep at once. He wakened with a start, sweating, his clothes rumpled, and walked aimlessly around the room. Then he lit a cigarette, sat down on the bed, and stared at the wrinkles in his trousers. The sour taste of sleep mingled with the cigarette smoke. He stared at the room again, scratching his ribs through his shirt. He was flooded by a dreadful pleasure at the prospect of so much desolation and solitude. To be so far away from everything, even from his fever, to suffer so distinctly here what was absurd and miserable in even the tidiest lives, showed him the shameful and secret countenance of a kind of freedom, born of the suspect, the shady. Around him, the flaccid hours lapped like a stagnant pond. Time had gone slack. Someone knocked violently, and Meursault, startled, realized that he had been awakened by the same knocking. He opened the door to find a little old man with red hair bent double under Meursault's 2 suitcases, which looked enormous in his hands. He was choking with rage, and his wide-spaced teeth released a stream of saliva as well as insults and recriminations. Meursault remembered the broken handle, which made the larger suitcase so difficult to carry. He wanted to apologize, but had no idea how to say he had never thought the porter would be so old. The tiny creature interrupted him. "That's 14 crowns. "For 1 day's storage?" Meursault asked, surprised. Then he understood, from the old man's laborious explanations, that the porter had taken a taxi. But Meursault dared not say that he himself could also have taken a taxi in that case, and he paid out of sheer reluctance to argue. Once the door was shut, Meursault felt inexplicable sobs swelling his chest. A nearby clock chimed 4 times. He had slept 2 hours. He realized he was separated from the street only by the house opposite his window, and he felt the dim, mysterious current of life so close to him. It would be better to go outside. Meursault washed his hands very carefully. He sat down on the bed again to clean his nails and work at the file methodically. Down in the courtyard, 2 or 3 buzzers rang out so emphatically that Meursault went back to the window. He noticed that an arched passageway led through the house to the street. It was as if all the voices of the street, all the unknown life on the other side of that house, the sounds of men who have an address, a family, arguments with an uncle, preferences at dinner, chronic diseases, the swarm of beings, each of whom has his own personality, forever divided from the monstrous heart of humanity by individual beats, filtered now through the passageway and rose through the courtyard to explode like bubbles in Meursault's room. Discovering how porous he was, how attentive to each sign the world made, Meursault recognized the deep flaw that opened his being to life. He lit another cigarette and hurriedly dressed. As he buttoned his jacket, the smoke stung his eyes. He turned back to the sink, put cold water on his eyes, and decided to comb his hair. But his comb had vanished. He was unable to smooth the sleep-rumpled curls with his fingers. He went downstairs as he was, his hair sticking up behind and hanging over his forehead. He felt diminished even further. Once out in the street, he walked around the hotel to reach the little passageway he had noticed. It opened onto the square of the old town hall, and in the heavy evening that sank over Prague, the Gothic steeples of the town hall and of the old church were silhouetted black against the dim sky. Crowds of people were walking under the arcades lining the old streets. Each time a woman passed him, Meursault waited for the glance that would permit him to consider himself still capable of playing the delicate and tender game of life. But healthy people have a natural skill in avoiding feverish eyes. Unshaven, his hair rumpled, in his eyes the expression of some restless animal, his trousers as wrinkled as his shirt collar, Meursault had lost that wonderful confidence bestowed by a well-cut suit or the steering wheel of a car. The light turned coppery, and the day still lingered on the gold of the Baroque domes at the far end of the square. He walked toward one of them, went into the church, and, overcome by the ancient smell, sat down on a bench. The vaults above him were quite dark, but the gilded capitals shed a mysterious golden liquid, which flowed down the grooves of the columns, to the puffy faces of angels and grinning saints. Peace, yes, there was peace here, but so bitter that Meursault hurried to the threshold and stood on the steps, inhaling the evening's cooler air into which he would plummet. In another moment, he saw the first star appear, pure and unadorned, between the steeples of tin. He began to look for a cheap restaurant, making his way into darker, less crowded streets. Though it had not rained during the day, the ground was damp, and Meursault had to pick his way among black puddles glimmering between the infrequent paving stones. A light rain started to fall. The busy streets could not be far away, for he could hear the newspaper vendors hawking the Narodny Politika. Meursault was walking in circles now, and suddenly stopped. A strange odor reached him out of the darkness. Pungent, sour, it awakened all his associations with suffering. He tasted it on his tongue, deep in his nose. Even his eyes, somehow, tasted it. It was far away, then it was at the next street corner. Between the now opaque sky and the sticky pavement it was there, the evil spell of the Knights of Prague. He advanced to meet it, and as he did so it became more real, filling him entirely, stinging his eyes until the tears came, leaving him helpless. Turning a corner, he understood. An old woman was selling cucumbers soaked in vinegar, and it was their fragrance which had assaulted Meursault. A passerby stopped, bought a cucumber which the old woman wrapped in a piece of paper. He took a few steps, unwrapped his purchase in front of Meursault, and, as he bit into the cucumber, its broken, sopping flesh released the odor even more powerfully. Meursault leaned against a post, nauseated, and for a long moment inhaled all the alien solitude the world could offer him. Then he walked away, and without even thinking what he was doing, entered a restaurant where an accordion was playing. He went down several steps stopped at the foot of the stairs, and found himself in a dim cellar filled with red lights. He must have looked peculiar, for the musician played more softly, the conversation stopped, and all the diners looked in his direction. In one corner some whores were eating together, their mouths shiny with greasy. Other customers were drinking the brown, Swedish Czech beer. Many were smoking without having ordered anything at all. Miro went over to a rather long table at which only one man was seated. Tall and slender with yellow hair, he was sprawled in his chair with his hands in his pockets and pursed his chapped lips round a matchstick already swollen with saliva, sucking it noisily or sliding it from one corner of his mouth to the other. When Miro sat down, the man barely moved, wedged his back against the wall, shifted the match in Miro's direction, and squinted faintly. At that moment Miro noticed a red star in his buttonhole. Miro ate the little he had ordered rapidly. He was not hungry. The accordionist was playing louder now, and staring fixedly at the newcomer. Twice Miro stared back defiantly, and tried to meet the man's gaze. But fever had weakened him. The man was still staring. Suddenly one of the whores burst out laughing. The man with the red star sucked noisily on his match and produced a little bubble of saliva, and the musician, still staring at Miro, broke off the lively dance tune he had been playing and began a slow melody, heavy with the dust of centuries. At this moment the door opened, and a new customer walked in. Miro did not see, but through the open door the smell of vinegar and cucumbers pressed in upon him, immediately filling the dark cellar, mingling with the mysterious melody of the accordion, swelling the bubble of saliva on the man's matchstick, making the conversation suddenly more meaningful, as if out of the night that lay upon Prague, all the significance of a miserable, suffering ancient world had taken refuge in the warmth of this room, among these people. Miro, who was eating some kind of over-sweetened compote, suddenly at the end of his endurance, felt the flaw he carried within himself yield, exposing him still more completely to pain and fever. He stood up abruptly, called to the waiter, and understanding nothing of his explanations, overpaid the check, realizing that the musician's gaze was once again fixed upon him. He walked to the door, passing the accordionist, and saw that he was still staring at the place at the table Miro had just left. Then he realized that the man was blind, walked up the steps, and, opening the door, was entirely engulfed by the omnipresent odor as he walked through the little streets into the depths of the night. Stars glittered over the houses. He must have been near the river. He could detect its muffled, powerful voice. In front of a little gate in a thick wall covered with Hebrew characters, he realized that he was in the ghetto. Over the wall stretched the branches of a sweet-smelling willow. Through the gate he could make out big brown stones lying among the weeds. It was the old Jewish cemetery of Prague. A moment later Miro realized he had been running and was now in the square of the old town hall. Near his hotel he had to lean against a wall and vomit, retching painfully. With all the lucidity extreme weakness affords, he managed to reach his room without making any mistakes, went to bed, and fell asleep at once. The next day he was awakened by the newspaper vendors. The day was still overcast, but the sun glowed behind the clouds. Though still a little weak, Miro felt better. But he thought of the long day which lay ahead of him. Living this way, in his own presence, time took on its most extreme dimensions, and each hour seemed to contain a world. The important thing was to avoid crises like the one yesterday. It would be best to do his sightseeing methodically. He sat at the table in his pajamas and worked out a systematic schedule which would occupy each of his days for a week. Monasteries and Baroque churches, museums, and the old parts of the city. Nothing was omitted. Then he washed, realized he had forgotten to buy a comb, and went downstairs as he had the day before, unkempt and taciturn, past the clerk whose bristling hair, bewildered expression, and jacket with the second button. Missing, he noticed now, in broad daylight. As he left the hotel, he was brought to a halt by a childish, sentimental accordion tune. The blind man of the night before, squatting on his heels at the corner of the old square, was playing with the same blank and smiling expression, as though liberated from himself and entirely contained within the motion of a life which exceeded him. Miro turned the corner and again recognized the smell of cucumbers, and with the smell, his suffering. That day was the same as those which followed. Miro got up late, visited monasteries and churches, sought refuge in their fragrance of crypts and incense, and then, back in the daylight, confronted his secret fears at every corner, where a cucumber vendor was invariably posted. It was through this odor that he saw the museums and discovered the mystery and the profusion of Baroque genius which filled Prague with its gold magnificence. The altars, which glowed softly in the darkness, seemed borrowed from the coppery sky, the misty sunlight so frequent over the city. The glistening scrolls and spirals, the elaborate setting that looked as if it were cut out of gold paper, so touching in its resemblance to the creches made for children at Christmas. The grandiose and grotesque Baroque perspectives affected Miro as a kind of infantile, feverish and overblown romanticism by which men protect themselves against their own demons. The god worshipped here was the god man fears and honors, not the god who laughs with man before the warm frolic of sea and sun. Emerging from the faint fragrance of dust and extinction which reigned under the dim vaults, Miro felt he had no country. Every evening he visited the cloister of the Czech monks on the west side of the city. In the cloister garden the hours fluttered away with the doves, the bells chimed softly over the grass, but it was still his fever which spoke to Miro. Nonetheless, the time passed. But then came the hour when the churches and monuments closed and the restaurants had not yet opened. That was the dangerous time. Miro walked along the Vltava's banks, dotted with flower beds and bandstands, as the day came to an end. Little boats worked their way up the river from lock to lock. Miro kept pace with them, left behind the deafening noise and rushing water of a sluice gate, gradually regained the peace and quiet of the evening, then walked on to meet a murmur which swelled to a terrible roar. At the new lock he watched the bright little dinghies vainly trying to pass over the dam without capsizing, until one of them passed the danger point, and shouts rang out above the sound of the water. The rushing river with its burden of shouts and tunes, the fragrance of gardens, full of the coppery glow of the setting sun, and the twisted, grotesque shadows of the statues on the Charles Bridge, made Miro bitterly conscious of his desolation, a solitude in which love had no part. Coming to a standstill as the fragrance of leaves and water reached him, he felt a catch in his throat and imagined tears which did not come. Tears would be for a friend, or for open arms. But tears gave way to the world without tenderness in which he was immersed. Some evenings, always at the same times, he crossed the Charles Bridge and strolled through the Hradčany district above the river, a deserted and silent neighborhood, though only a few steps from the busiest streets in the city. He wandered among these huge palaces, across enormous paved courtyards, past ironwork gates, around the cathedral. His footsteps echoed in the silence between high walls. A dim noise from the city reached him here. There was no cucumber vendor in this district, but something oppressive in the silence, in the grandeur of the place, so that Miro always ended by walking back toward the odor or the melody which henceforth constituted his only country. He ate his meals in the restaurant he had discovered, for at least it remained familiar. He had his place beside the man with the red star, who came only in the evenings, drank a beer, and chewed on his matchstick. At dinner, too, the blind man played his accordion, and Miro ate quickly, paid his check, and returned to his hotel in the unfailing sleep of a feverish child. Every day he thought of leaving, and every day, sinking a little deeper into desolation. His longing for happiness had a little less hold over him. He had been in Prague 4 days now, and he had not yet bought the comb whose absence he discovered each morning. Yet he had the vague sense of something missing, and this was what he irresolutely waited for. One evening, he walked toward his restaurant down the little street where he had first smelled the cucumbers. Already he anticipated that odor, when just before he reached the restaurant, on the sidewalk opposite him, something made him stop, then come closer. A man was lying there, arms folded, head fallen on the left cheek. 3 or 4 people were standing against the wall, apparently waiting for something, though very calm. One was smoking, the others were speaking in low voices. But one man in shirt sleeves, his jacket over his arm, hat pushed back on his head, was performing a kind of wild dance around the body, his gestures emphatic and disturbing. Overhead, the faint light of a distant street lamp mingled with the glow from the nearby restaurant. The man tirelessly dancing, the body with its folded arms, the calm spectators, the ironic contrast, and the inexplicable silence, here at last, combining contemplation and innocence, among the rather oppressive interplay of light and shadow, was a moment of equilibrium beyond which it seemed to Miro that everything would collapse into madness. He came closer. The dead man's head was lying in a pool of blood. The head was turned so that it rested on the wound. In this remote corner of Prague, between the faint light on the moist pavement, the long, wet hiss of passing cars a few steps away, the distant screech of occasional streetcars, death seemed insipid yet insistent too, and it was death's summons, its damp breath, that Miro sensed at the very moment he began walking away rapidly, without turning back. Suddenly the odor, which he had forgotten, was all around him. He went into the restaurant and sat down at his table. The man was there, but without his matchstick. It seemed to Miro that there was something distraught in his eyes. He dismissed the stupid notion that occurred to him, but everything was whirling in his mind. Before ordering anything, he jumped up and ran to his hotel, went to his room, and threw himself on the bed. Something sharp was throbbing in his temples. His heart empty, his belly tight, Miro's rebellion exploded. Images of his life rushed before his eyes. Something inside him clamored for the gestures of women, for arms that opened, and for warm lips. From the depth of the painful nights of Prague, amid smells of vinegar and sentimental tunes, the anguished countenance of the old Baroque world which had accompanied his fever mounted toward him. Breathing with difficulty, seeing nothing, moving mechanically, he sat up on his bed. The drawer of the night table was open, lined with an English newspaper in which he read a whole article. Then he stretched out on the bed again. The man's head had been lying on the wound, and 3 or 4 fingers would have fit inside that wound. Miro stared at his hands and his fingers, and childish desires rose in his heart. An intense and secret fervor swelled within him, and it was a nostalgia for cities filled with sunlight and women, with the green evenings that close all wounds. Tears burst from his eyes. Inside him widened a great lake of solitude and silence, above which ran the sad song of his deliverance. In the train taking him north, Miro stared at his hands. The train's speed turned the lowering sky into an onrush of heavy clouds. Miro was alone in the overheated compartment. He had left suddenly in the middle of the night, and with the dark morning hours ahead of him, he let the mild landscape of Bohemia rush by, the impending rain between the tall, silky poplars and the distant factory chimneys filling him with an impulse to burst into tears. Then he looked at the white plaque with its 3 sentences. Nicht hinauslehnen, è pericoloso sporgersi, il est dangereux de se pencher au dehors. He looked again at his hands, which lay like live, wild animals on his knees, the left one long and supple, the right thicker, muscular. He knew them, recognized them, yet they were distinct from himself, as though capable of actions in which his will had no part. One came to rest against his forehead now, pressing against the fever which throbbed in his temples. The other slid down his jacket and took out of its pocket a cigarette, that he immediately discarded as soon as he became aware of an overpowering desire to vomit. His hands returned to his knees, palms cupped, where they offered Meersalt, the emblem of his life, indifferent once more and offered to anyone who would take it. He traveled for 2 days. But now it was not an instinct of escape which drove him on. The very monotony of the journey satisfied him. The train which was jolting him halfway across Europe suspended him between 2 worlds. It had taken him abroad, and would deposit him somewhere, draw him out of a life the very moment of which he wanted to erase, and lead him to the threshold of a new world, where desire would be king. Not for a single moment was Meersalt bored. He sat in his corner, rarely disturbed by anyone, stared at his hands, then at the countryside, and reflected. He deliberately extended his trip as far as Breslau, merely rousing himself at the border to change tickets. He wanted to stay where he was, contemplating his freedom. He was tired and did not feel well enough to move. He hoarded every last fragment of his strength, his hopes, kneaded them together until he had refashioned himself and his fate as well. He loved these long nights when the train rushed along the gleaming rails, roaring through the village stations where only a clock was illuminated. The sudden stops among the clustered lights of city stations, where there was no time to discover where he was, before the train was already swallowed up. A golden warmth cast into the compartments, and then gone. Hammers pounded on the wheels. The engine exhaled its cloud of steam, and the robot gesture of the switchman, lowering his red disc, hurled Meersalt into the train's wild course, only his lucidity, his anxiety awake. The crosswork puzzle of lights and shadows went on in the compartment, a black and gold motley. Dresden, Bautzen, Görlitz, Lügnitz, the long, lonely night ahead of him, with all the time in the world to decide on the actions of a future life. The patient straggle with the thoughts eluding him on a station siding, recaptured and pursued again, the consequences reappearing and escaping once more before the dance of wires glistening under the rain and the lights. Meersalt groped for the word, the sentence that would formulate the hope in his heart, that would resolve his anxiety. In his weakened state, he needed formulas. The night and then the day passed in this obstinate struggle with the word, the image which from now on would constitute the whole tonality of his mind, the sympathetic or miserable dream of his future. He closed his eyes. It takes time to live. Like any work of art, life needs to be thought about. Meersalt thought about his life and exercised his bewildered consciousness and his longing for happiness in a train compartment, which was like one of those cells where a man learns to know what he is by what is more than himself. On the morning of the second day, in the middle of a field, the train slowed down. Breslau was still hours away, and the day broke over the vast Silesian plain, a treeless sea of mud under an overcast sky, sagging with rain clouds. As far as the eye could see, and at regular intervals, huge black birds with glistening wings flew in flocks a few yards above the ground, incapable of rising any higher under a rain-swollen sky heavy as a tombstone. They circled in a slow, ponderous flight, and sometimes one of them would leave the flock, skim the ground almost inseparable from it, and flap in the same lethargic flight, until it was far enough away to be silhouetted on the horizon, a black dot. Meersalt wiped the steam off the glass and stared greedily through the long streaks his fingers left on the pane. Between the desolate earth and the colorless sky appeared an image of the ungrateful world in which, for the first time, he came to himself at last. On this earth, restored to the despair of innocence, a traveler lost in a primitive world, he regained contact, and with his list pressed to his chest, his face flattened against the glass, he calculated his hunger for himself and for the certainty of the splendors dormant within him. He wanted to crush himself into that mud, to re-enter the earth by immersing himself in that clay, to stand on that limitless plain covered with dirt, stretching his arms to the sooty sponge of the sky, as though confronting the superb and despairing symbol of life itself. to affirm his solidarity with the world at its worst, to declare himself life's accomplice even in its thanklessness and its filth. Then the great impulse that had sustained him collapsed for the first time since he left Prague. Miro pressed his tears and his lips against the cold pane. Again the glass blurred, the landscape disappeared. A few hours later he arrived in Breslau. From a distance the city looked like a forest of factory chimneys and church steeples. At close range it was made of brick and black stone. Men in visored caps walked slowly through the streets. Miro followed them, spent the morning in a workman's cafe. A boy was playing the harmonica, tune of a sentimental stupidity which eased the soul. Miro decided to travel south again, after buying a comb. The next day he was in Vienna. He slept a part of the day and the whole next night. When he awakened, his fever was completely gone. He stuffed himself on soft-boiled eggs and thick cream for breakfast, and feeling a little squeamish walked out into a morning speckled with sunshine and rain. Vienna was a refreshing city. There was nothing to visit. St. Stephen's Cathedral was too big and bored him. He preferred the cafes around it, and in the evening a little dance hall near the banks of the canal. During the day he strolled along the ring, in the luxury of the shop windows and the elegant women. He enjoyed this frivolous and expensive decor which divides man from himself in the least natural city in the world. But the women were pretty, the flowers bright and sturdy in the gardens, and over the ring at twilight, in the brilliant, carefree crowd, Miro stared at the feudal caracole of stone horses against the red sky. It was then that he remembered his friends Rose and Claire. For the first time since Léon's, he wrote a letter. It was the overflow of his silence that he put down on paper. Dear children, I'm writing from Vienna. I don't know what you're doing, but speaking for myself, I'm traveling for a living. I've seen a lot of beautiful things with a heavy heart. Here in Vienna, beauty has been replaced by civilization. It's a relief. I'm not looking at churches or ruins. I take walks in the ring. And in the evening, over the theaters and the sumptuous palaces, the blind steeplechase of stone horses in the sunset fills me with a strange mixture of bitterness and delight. Mornings I eat soft-boiled eggs and thick cream. I get up late. The hotel people shower attention on me. I'm very impressed with the style of the maître d'hôtel and stuffed with good food. Oh, the cream here. There are lots of shows, and the women are good-looking. The only thing missing is the sun. What are you up to? Tell me about yourselves and describe the sun to a miserable wretch who has no roots anywhere, and who remains your faithful Patrice Miro. That evening, having written his letter, he went back to the dance hall. He had arranged to spend the evening with Helen, one of the hostesses who knew a little French and understood his poor German. Leaving the dance hall at 2 a.m, he walked her home, made love efficiently, and wakened the next morning against Helen's back, disinterestedly admiring her long hips and broad shoulders. He got up without waking her, slipped the money into her shoe. As he was about to open the door, she called to him, "But darling, you've made a mistake." He returned to the bed, and he had made a mistake. Unfamiliar with Austrian currency, he had left a 500-shilling note instead of 100 shillings. "No," he said, smiling. "It's for you. You were wonderful." Helen's freckled face broke into a grin under her rumpled blonde hair. She jumped up on the bed and kissed him on both cheeks. That kiss, doubtless the first she had given him spontaneously, kindled a spark of emotion in Miro. He made her lie down, tucked her in, walked to the door again, and looked back with a smile. "Goodbye," he said. She opened her eyes wide above the sheet that was pulled up to her nose and let him vanish without a word. A few days later, Miro received an answer postmarked Algiers. "Dear Patrice, we're in Algiers. Your children would be very glad to see you again. If you have nothing to do in the world, why don't you come to Algiers We have room for you in the house. We're all happy here. We're ashamed of it, of course, but only for appearance's sake, and because of popular prejudice. If happiness appeals to you, come and try it here. It's better than re-enlisting. We bend our brows to your paternal kisses. Rose, Claire, Catherine. P.S. Catherine protests against the word paternal. Catherine is living with us. If you approve, she can be your third daughter. He decided to return to Algiers by way of Genoa. As other men need to be alone before making their crucial decisions, Miro, poisoned by solitude and alienation, needed to withdraw into friendship and confidence, to enjoy an apparent security before choosing his life. In the train heading across northern Italy toward Genoa, he listened to the thousand voices that lured him on, the siren songs of happiness. By the time he reached the first cypresses, springing straight up from the naked soil, he had yielded. He still felt weak, feverish, but something in him had relented. Soon, as the sun advanced through the day and the sea drew closer, under a broad sky pouring light and air over the shivering olive trees, the exultation which stirred the world joined the enthusiasms of his own heart. The noise of the train, the chatter in the crowded compartment, everything that laughed and sang around him kept time to a kind of inner dance which projected him, sitting motionless hour after hour, to the ends of the earth, and at last released him, jubilant and speechless, into the deafening bustle of Genoa, the brilliant harbor echoing the brilliant sky, where desire and indolence struggled against each other until dark. He was thirsty, hungry for love, eager for pleasure. The gods who burned within him cast him into the sea, on a tiny beach at one end of the harbor, where the water tasted of salt and tear, and he swam until he forgot his own body. Then he wandered through the narrow, redolent streets of the old part of the city, letting the colors claw at his eyes, and the sky devour itself above the houses, the cats sleeping among the summer's filth, flattened by the burden of the sun. He walked along a road overlooking the entire city, and the flickering, fragrant sea rose toward him in one long, irresistible swell. Closing his eyes, Miro gripped the warm stone he sat on, opening them again to stare at this city, where sheer excess of life flaunted its exultant bad taste. At noon he would sit on the ramp, leading down to the harbor, and watch the women walking up from the offices on the docks. In sandals and bright summer dresses, breasts bobbing, they left Miro's tongue dry and his heart pounding with desire, a desire in which he recognized both a release and a justification. Evenings, he would see the same women in the streets and follow them, the ardent animal coiled in his loins, stirring with a fierce delight. For 2 days he smoldered in this inhuman exultation. On the third day he left Genoa for Algiers, all during the crossing staring at the water and the light on the water, first in the morning, then in the middle of the day, and then in the evening. He matched his heart against the slow pulse of the sky and returned to himself. He scorned the vulgarity of certain cures. Stretched out on the deck, he realized that there could be no question of sleeping, but that he must stay awake, must remain conscious, despite friends, despite the comfort of body and soul. He had to create his happiness and his justification, and doubtless the task would be easier for him now. At the strange peace that filled him as he watched the evening suddenly freshening upon the sea, the first star slowly hardening in the sky where the light died out green to be reborn yellow, he realized that after this great tumult and this fury, what was dark and wrong within him was gone now, yielding to the clear water, transparent now, of a soul restored to kindness, to resolution. He understood how long he had craved a woman's love, and he was not made for love. All his life, the office on the docks, his room and his nights of sleep there, the restaurant he went to, his mistress, he had pursued single-mindedly a happiness which in his heart he believed was impossible. In this he was no different from everyone else. He had played at wanting to be happy. Never had he sought happiness with a conscious and deliberate desire. Never until the day. And from that moment on, because of a single act calculated in utter lucidity, his life had changed, and happiness seemed possible. Doubtless he had given birth to this new being in suffering, but what was that suffering compared to the degrading farce he had performed till now? He saw, for instance, what had attached him to Martha was vanity, not love. Even that miracle of the lips she offered him was nothing more than the delighted astonishment of a power acknowledged and awakened by the conquest. The meaning of his affair with Martha consisted of the replacement of that initial astonishment by a certainty, the triumph of vanity over modesty. What he had loved in Martha were those evenings when they would walk into the movie theater and men's eyes turned toward her, that moment when he offered her to the world. What he loved in her was his power and his ambition to live. Even his desire, the deepest craving of his flesh, probably derived from this initial astonishment at possessing a lovely body, at mastering and humiliating it. Now he knew he was not made for such love, but for the innocent and terrible love of the dark god he would henceforth serve. As often happens, what was best in his life had crystallized around what was worst. Claire and her friends, Zagreus and his will to happiness, had all crystallized around Martha. He knew now that it was his own will to happiness which must make the next move. But if it was to do so, he realized that he must come to terms with time, that to have time was at once the most magnificent and the most dangerous of experiments. Idleness is fatal only to the mediocre. Most men cannot even prove they are not mediocre. He had won that right. But the proof remained to be shown, the risk to be run. Only one thing had changed. He felt free of his past and of what he had lost. He wanted nothing now but this contraction and this enclosure inside himself, this lucid and patient fervor in the face of the world. As with warm dough that's squeezed and kneaded, all he wanted was to hold his life between his hands, the way he felt during those 2 long nights on the train when he would talk to himself, prepare himself to live, to lick the life like barley sugar, to shape it, sharpen it, love it at last. That was his whole passion. This presence of himself to himself, henceforth his effort would be to maintain it in the face of everything in his life, even at the cost of a solitude he knew now was so difficult to endure. He would not submit. All his violence would help him now, and at the point to which it raised him, his love would join him, like a furious passion to live. The sea wrinkled slowly against the ship's sides, the sky filled with stars, and Miro, in silence, felt in himself extreme and violent powers to love, to marvel at this life with its countenance of sunlight and tears, this life in its salt and hot stone. It seemed that by caressing this life, all his powers of love and despair would unite. That was his poverty. That was his sole wealth. As if by writing 0, he was starting over, but with a consciousness of his powers and a lucid intoxication which urged him on in the face of his fate. And then Algiers, the slow arrival in the morning, the dazzling cascade of the Kasbah above the sea, the hills and the sky, the bay's outstretched arms, the houses among the trees, and the smell, already upon him, of the docks. Then Miro realized that not once since Vienna had he thought of Zagreus as the man he had killed with his own hands. He recognized in himself that power to forget which only children have, and geniuses, and the innocent. Innocent, overwhelmed by joy, he understood at last that he was made for happiness. Patrice and Catherine are having their breakfast on the terrace in the sun. Catherine is in her bathing suit, the boy, as Miro's friends call him. The boy is in his shorts, a napkin around his neck. They are eating salted tomatoes, potato salad, honey, and huge amounts of fruit. They keep the peaches on ice and lick the tiny drops which have congealed on the velvety skins. They also make grape juice, which they drink with their faces tipped toward the sun in order to get a tan. At least the boy does. for he knows a suntan becomes him. "Taste the sun," Patrice said, holding out his arm to Catherine. She licked his arm. "Yes," she said, "now you." He tasted too, then stretched and stroked his ribs. Catherine sprawled on her stomach and pulled her bathing suit down to her hips. "I'm not indecent, am I?" "No," the boy said, not looking. The sun streamed down, lingering over his face. The moist pores absorbed this fire which sheathed his body and put him to sleep. Catherine drowned in the sun, sighed and moaned. "Oh, it's good." "Yes," the boy said. The house perched on a hilltop with a view of the bay. It was known in the neighborhood as the House of the Three Students. A steep path led up to it, beginning in olive trees and ending in olive trees. Between, a kind of landing followed a gray wall covered with obscene figures and political slogans to encourage the winded visitor. Then more olive trees, blue patches of sky between the branches, and the smell of the gum trees bordering reddish fields in which purple, yellow, and orange cloths were spread out to dry. After a great deal of sweating and panting, the visitor pushed open a little blue gate, avoiding the bougainvillea tendrils, and then climbed a stairway, steep as a ladder but drenched in a blue shade that already slaked his thirst. Rose, Claire, Catherine, and the boy called the place the House Above the World. Open to the view on all sides, it was a kind of balloon gondola suspended in the brilliant sky over the motley dance of the world. From the perfect curve of the bay far below, a nameless energy gathered up the weeds, the grass and the sun, swept on the pines and the cypresses, the dusty olive trees and the eucalyptus, to the very walls of the house. Depending on the season, white dog roses and mimosa bloomed at the heart of this offering, or the kind of honeysuckle that spreads its fragrance over the walls on summer nights. White sheets and red roofs, the sea smiling under a sky pinned without a wrinkle from one edge of the horizon to the other. The House Above the World trained its huge bay windows on a carnival of colors and lights, day and night. But in the distance, a line of high purple mountains joined the bay and its extreme slope and contained this intoxication within its far contour. Here no one complained of the steep path or of exhaustion. Everyone had his joy to conquer, every day, living above the world, each discovering his own weight, seeing his face brighten and darken with the day, the night. Each of the 4 inhabitants of the house was aware of a presence that was at once a judge and a justification among them. The world here became a personage, counted among those from whom advice is gladly taken, those in whom equilibrium has not killed love. They called the world to witness. "The world and I," Patrice would say, about nothing in particular, "we disapprove of you." Catherine, for whom being naked meant ridding herself of inhibitions, took advantage of the boy's absences to undress on the terrace. And after staying out to watch the sky's colors change, she announced at dinner with a kind of sensual pride, "I was naked in front of the world." "Yes," Patrice said scornfully, "women naturally prefer their ideas to their sensations." Then Catherine protested. She loathed being an intellectual. And Rose and Claire in chorus, "Shut up, Catherine, you're wrong." For it was understood that Catherine was always wrong, being the one the others were fond of in the same way. She had a sluggish, toast-colored, deliberate body and an animal instinct for what is essential. No one could decipher better than Catherine the secret language of trees, of the sea, of the wind. "That child," Claire would say, eating incessantly, "is a force of nature." Then they would all go outside to lie in the sun, and no one would speak. Man diminishes man's powers. The world leaves them intact. Rose, Claire, Catherine, and Patrice lived, at the windows of their house, on images and appearances, consented to a kind of game they played with each other, receiving with laughter, friendship, and affection alike, but returning to the dance of sea and sky, rediscovered the secret color of their fate, and finally confronted the deepest part of themselves. Sometimes the cats came to join their masters. Gula would creep out, perpetually offended, a black question mark with green eyes, slender and delicate, suddenly seized by a fit of madness and pouncing on shadows. "It's a matter of glands," Rose said, and then she would laugh, surrendering to her laugh, her eyes squinting behind the round sunglasses under her curly hair, until Gula leaped into her lap, a special privileged, and then her fingers would wander over the glistening fur, and Rose subsided, relaxed, becoming a cat with tender eyes, calming the animal with her mild and fraternal hands, for cats were Rose's escape into the world, as nakedness was Catherine's. Claire preferred Callie, the other cat, as gentle and stupid as his dirty white fur, who let himself be teased for hours at a time. And Claire, her Florentine face intent, would feel her soul swell within her. Silent and withdrawn, she was given to sudden outbursts and had a splendid appetite. Noticing that she was gaining weight, Patrice scolded her. "You're disgusting. A lovely creature is not entitled to grow ugly." But Rose intervened. "Please stop tormenting the child. Eat, Claire, darling." And the day turned from the rising sun to the setting sun around the hills and over the sea, inside the delicate light. They laughed, teased each other, made plans. Everyone smiled at appearances and pretended to submit to them. Patrice proceeded from the face of the world to the grave and smiling faces of the young women. Sometimes he was amazed by this universe they had created around him. Friendship and trust, sun and white houses, scarcely heeded nuances. Here felicities were born intact, and he could measure their precise resonance. The house above the world, they said among themselves, was not a house of pleasure, it was a house of happiness. Patrice knew it was true when night fell, and they all accepted, with the last breeze on their faces, the human and dangerous temptation to be utterly unique. Today, after the sunbath, Catherine had gone to her office. "My dear Patrice," Rose announced, suddenly appearing, "I have some good news for you." The boy was conscientiously lounging on a couch in the terrace room, a detective story in his hands. "My dear Rose, I'm all ears. Today is your turn in the kitchen." "Splendid," Patrice said without moving. Rose stuffed into her student's satchel not only the sweet peppers for her lunch, but also Volume 3 of Levice's boring history, and left. Patrice, who would be cooking lentils, loafed around the big Osher room until 11. Walking between the couches and the shelves decorated with green, yellow, and red masks, touching the beige and orange draperies. Then he quickly boiled the lentils, put some oil in the pot, an onion to brown, a tomato, a bouquet garni, fussed over the stove and cursed Gula and Callie for announcing their hunger, despite the fact that Rose had explained to them yesterday, "Now you animals know it's too hot in the summer to be hungry." Catherine arrived at 11:45, stripped off her light dress and open sandals and insisted on a shower and a nap in the sun. She would be the last at the table, and Rose would admonish her. "Catherine, you're intolerable." The water hissed in the bathroom, and Claire appeared, breathless from the climb. "Lentils? I know the best way of—" "I know too. You take fresh cream. We've all learned our lesson, dear Claire." It is a fact that Claire's recipes always begin with fresh, thick cream. "The boy is absolutely right," said Rose, who had just arrived. "Yes," the boy agreed. "Let's sit down. Meals are served in the kitchen, which looks like a prop room. There is even a pad to write down Rose's good lines. Claire says, 'We may be chic, but we're simple too,' and eats her sausage with her fingers." Catherine comes to the table duly late, drunk with the sun and plaintive, her eyes pale with sleep. There is not enough vitriol in her soul to do justice to her office. 8 hours she subtracts from the world, and her life to give to a typewriter. The girls understand, thinking of what their own lives would be with those 8 hours amputated. Patrice says nothing, Yes, Rose says, made uneasy by any show of feelings. Well, it's your own business. Besides, you talk about that office of yours every day. We'll forbid you to speak. But, Catherine sighs. Put it to a vote. 1, 2, 3. You're outvoted. You see, Claire says, as the lentils are brought on. Too dry, and everyone eats in silence. When Claire does the cooking and tastes her food at the table, she always adds with a satisfied expression, "My, that's just delicious." Patrice, who has his dignity, prefers to say nothing, until everyone bursts out laughing. This is certainly not Catherine's day, for she lectures them all about reducing her office hours and asks someone to go with her to complain. No, Rose says, after all, you're the one who works. Exasperated, the force of nature goes outside and lies in the sun, but soon everyone joins her there, and absently caressing Catherine's hair, Claire decrees that what this child needs is a man. For it is common practice in the house above the world to settle Catherine's fate, to attribute certain needs to her, and to establish their extent and variety. Of course, she points out from time to time that she's old enough, etc., but no one pays any attention. Poor thing, Rose says. She needs a lover. Then everyone surrenders to the sun. Catherine, who never holds a grudge, tells the gossip about her office. How Mademoiselle Perez, the tall blonde who got married recently, had asked everyone in the office for information in order to be prepared for the ordeal, and what horrifying descriptions the salesman had given her. And with what relief back from her honeymoon, she had smilingly declared, it wasn't so bad as all that. She's 30 years old, Catherine adds pityingly, and Rose objecting to these off-color stories. All right, Catherine, she says, we aren't just girls here. At this time of day, the mail plane passes over the city, bearing the glory of its glittering metal over land and through the heavens. It enters into the movement of the harbor, incorporates itself into the course of the world, and, suddenly abandoning its frivolities, sheers off and dives down to the sea, landing in a tremendous explosion of blue and white water. Gula and Kali lie on their sides, their tiny adder mouths showing the pink of their palates, their bodies throbbing with lustful and obscene dreams. The sky releases its burden of sun and color. Eyes closed, Catherine takes the long fall that carries her deep into herself, down where some animal stirs gently, breathing like a god. The next Sunday, guests have been invited. It is Claire's turn in the kitchen. Hence, Rose has peeled the vegetables, set the table. Claire will put the vegetables in the pots and watch over the cooking, reading in her room, occasionally emerging to glance under the lids. Since Mina, the Arab girl, has not come this morning, having lost her father for the 3rd time this year, Rose has also cleaned the house. The first guest arrives, Eliane, whom Merceau calls the idealist. Why? Eliane asks. Because when you hear something true that upsets you, you say, that's true, but it's not good. Eliane has a good heart, and she thinks she looks like the man with a glove, though no one else does. But her room is lined with reproductions of the man with a glove. Eliane is studying something or other, and the first time she came to the house above the world, she announced that she was enchanted by the inhabitants' lack of inhibitions. In time, she has found this less convenient. A lack of inhibition means telling her that her stories are a bore, or declaring, quite amiably, as soon as the first words are out of her mouth, Eliane, you're an idiot. When Eliane comes into the kitchen with Noël, the second guest and a sculptor by profession, she stumbles over Catherine, who never does anything in a normal position. Now she's lying on her back, eating grapes with one hand and stirring with the other a mayonnaise that is still thin. Rose, in a huge blue apron, is admiring Gula's perspicacity. The cat has jumped up onto the shelf to eat the dessert. No doubt about it, Rose says blissfully. That creature has a mind of her own. Yes, Catherine says, she's outdone herself today. adding that in the morning Gula, with more of a mind than ever, had broken the little green lamp and a vase as well. Eliane and Noel, doubtless too winded to express their disgust, decide to take a seat no one has dreamed of offering them. Claire arrives, friendly and languorous, shakes hands and tastes the bouillabaisse simmering on the stove. She decides they can start. But today, Patrice is late. Then he appears and explains in great detail to Eliane that he is in a good mood because the girls in the street are so pretty. The hot season is just beginning, but already the firm bodies are beginning to be revealed by the light dresses, hence Patrice, as he testifies, is left in a devastated state, mouth dry, temples throbbing, loins hot. This insistence on detail silences Eliane. At table, a general consternation follows the first spoonfuls of bouillabaisse. Claire announces playfully, "I'm afraid the bouillabaisse tastes of burned onion." "Oh no," Noel answers politely. Then, to test those manners, Rose asks him to purchase for the household a certain number of useful items, such as a hot water heater, Persian carpets, and a refrigerator. When Noel replies by encouraging Rose to pray for him to win the lottery, Rose becomes quite realistic. "We might as well pray for ourselves. The sun is hot and heavy now, which makes the iced wine all the more precious. And the fruit, welcome." With the coffee, Eliane bravely changes the subject to love. If she were in love, she would get married. Catherine tells her that it's more urgent when in love, to make love, and that materialistic point of view convulses Eliane. Rose, the pragmatist, would approve if, unfortunately, experience did not show that marriage dissolves love. But Eliane and Catherine force their opinions into opposition and become unfair, as anyone with spirit feels obliged to do. Noel, who thinks in shapes and in clay, believes in women, in children, and in the patriarchal truth of a concrete and sensuous life. Then Rose, exasperated beyond endurance by the outcry raised by Eliane and Catherine, pretends to understand, suddenly, the reasons for Noel's frequent visits. "I want to thank you now," she said, "though I find it difficult to tell you how much this discovery overwhelms me. I'll speak to my father tomorrow about our project, and you yourself may apply to him in a few days." "But," Noel says, for Noel doesn't quite follow. "Oh," Rose says, with tremendous energy, "I know. I understand without your having to speak a word. You're the kind of man who can hold his tongue and let other people guess what he's thinking. But I'm glad you've declared yourself at last, for the persistence of your attentions was beginning to sully the purity of my reputation." Noel, vaguely amused and also vaguely alarmed, declares himself delighted to find his aspirations crowned with success. "Not to mention," Patrice says before lighting a cigarette, "that you'll have to act fast. Rose's condition obliges you to take certain steps promptly." "What?" "Oh, heavens," Claire says. "It's only her second month. Besides," Rose adds tenderly and persuasively, "you've reached the age when you enjoy finding your own face in another man's child." Noel frowns, and Claire says good-naturedly, "It's only a joke. Just play along with it, Noel, and let's go inside." At which point the discussion of principles comes to an end. Nonetheless, Rose, who does her good deeds in secret, speaks affectionately to Eliane. In the big room, Patrice sits at the window, Claire leans against the table, and Catherine is lying on the floor. The others are on the couch. There is a heavy mist over the city and the harbor, but the tugboats go about their work, and their deep hoots rise to the house on gusts of tar and fish. The world of black and red hulls, of rusty anchors and chains sticky with seaweed wakening down below. As always, the strong, fraternal summons of a life of manly effort tempts everyone. Eliane says to Rose sadly, "Then you're just like me." "No," Rose answers. "I'm merely trying to be happy as possible." "And love isn't the only way," Patrice says without turning around. He's very fond of Eliane, and afraid he has hurt her feelings just now. But he understands Rose and her thirst for happiness. A mediocre ideal Eliane declares. "I don't know if it's mediocre, but it's a healthy one. And that—" Patrice breaks off. Rose closes her eyes. Gula has jumped into her lap, and by slowly caressing the cat's skull and back, Rose anticipates that secret marriage in which the squinting cat and the motionless woman will see the same universe out of the same half-closed eyes. Everyone muses, between the long calls of the tugboats. Rose lets Gula's purring rise within her, starting from the coiled beast in the hollow of her body. The heat presses on her eyes and immerses her in a silence inhabited by the throbbing of her own blood. The cats sleep for days at a time and make love from the first star until dawn. Their pleasures are fierce and their sleep impenetrable. And they know that the body has a soul in which the soul has no part. "Yes," Rose says, opening her eyes, "to be as happy as possible." Meursault was thinking about Lucienne Reynal. When he had said that the women in the streets were pretty, he meant that one woman in particular was pretty. He had met her at a friend's house. A week before they had gone out together, and having nothing to do, had strolled along the harbor boulevards all one fine hot morning. Lucienne had not opened her mouth, and as he walked her home, Meursault was startled to find himself squeezing her hand a long time and smiling at her. She was quite tall and was wearing no hat, only a white linen dress and sandals. On the boulevards they had walked into a slight breeze, and Lucienne set her feet flat on the warm cobbles, bracing herself with each step against the wind. As she did so, her dress became pasted against her body, outlining her smooth, curving belly. With her blonde hair pulled back, her small, straight nose, and the splendid thrust of her breasts, she represented and even sanctioned a kind of secret agreement which linked her to the earth and organized the world around her movements. As her bag swayed from her right wrist and a silver bracelet tinkled against its clasp, she raised her left hand over her head to protect herself from the sun. The tip of her right foot was still on the earth but was about to take off, and at that moment she seemed to Patrice to wed her gestures to the world. It was then that he experienced the mysterious harmony which matched his gestures with Lucienne's. They walked well together, and it was no effort for him to keep in step with her. Doubtless this harmony was facilitated by Lucienne's flat shoes. But all the same, there was something in their respective strides, which were similar in both length and flexibility. Meursault noticed Lucienne's silence and the closed expression of her face. He decided that she was probably not very intelligent, and that pleased him. There is something divine in mindless beauty, and Meursault was particularly responsive to it. All of this made him linger over Lucienne's hand when he said goodbye, and made him see her again, inviting her to take long walks at the same silent pace, offering their tanned faces to the sun or the stars, swimming together and matching their gestures and their strides without exchanging anything but the presence of their bodies. And then, last night, Meursault had discovered again a familiar and overwhelming miracle on Lucienne's lips. Until then, what moved him had been her way of clinging to his clothes, of following him, of taking his arm, her abandonment and her trust that touched him as a man. Her silence, too, by which she put all of herself into each momentary gesture and emphasized her resemblance to the cats, a resemblance to which she already owed the gravity characterizing all her actions. Yesterday after dinner, they had strolled together on the docks. They had stopped against the ramp leading up to the boulevard, and Lucienne had pressed against Meursault. In the darkness, he felt under his ringers the cool, prominent cheekbones and the warm lips which opened under his pressure. Then there was something like a great cry within him, gratuitous yet ardent. From the starry night and the city that was like a spilled sky, swollen with human lights under the warm, deep breeze that rose from the harbor. He drew the thirst of this warm spring, the limitless longing to seize from these vibrant lips all the meaning of that inhuman and dormant world, like a silence enclosed in her mouth. He bent over her, and it was as if he had rested his lips on a bird. Lucienne moaned. He nibbled her lips, and sucked in that warmth which transported him as if he had embraced the world in his arms. And she clung to him like a drowning girl, rising again and again from the depth into which she had sunk, drew back and then offered him her lips again, falling once more into the cold abyss that enfolded her like a divine oblivion. But Eliane was leaving now. A long afternoon of silence and reflection lay ahead of Morceau in his room. At dinner no one spoke, but by mutual consent they went out onto the terrace. The days always ended by melting into the days. From the morning above the harbor, glistening with sun and mist, to the mildness of the evening above the harbor. Day broke over the sea, and the sun set behind the hills, for the sky showed only the one road, passing from the sea to the hills. The world says only one thing: it wakens, then it wearies. But there always comes a time when it vanquishes by mere repetition and gains the reward of its own perseverance. Thus the days of the house above the world, woven of that luxuriant fabric of laughter and simple acts, ended on the terrace under the star-studded night. Rose and Claire and Patrice stretched out on the deck chairs. Catherine sat on the parapet. In the sky, night showed them its shining face, radiant and secret. Lights passed far below in the harbor, and the screech of trains occasionally reached them. The stars swelled, then shrank, vanished, and were reborn, drawing evanescent figures, creating new ones moment by moment. In the silence, the night recovered its density, its flesh. Filled with twinkling stars, it left in their eyes the play of lights that tears can bring. And each of them, plunging into the depths of the sky, found that extreme point where everything coincides, the secret and tender meditation which makes up the solitude of one's life. Catherine, suddenly choked with love, could only sigh. Patrice, who felt that his voice would crack, nonetheless asked, "Don't you feel cold?" "No," Rose said. "Besides, it's so beautiful." Claire stood up, put her hands on the parapet, and held her face up to the sky. Facing everything noble and elementary in the world, she united her life with her longing for life, identified her hopes with the movement of the stars. Suddenly turning around, she said to Patrice, "On good days, if you trust life, life has to answer you." "Yes," Patrice said without looking at her. A star fell. Behind it, a distant beacon broadened in the night that was deeper now. Some men were climbing up the path in silence. He could hear the sound of their footsteps, their heavy breathing. Then the smell of flowers reached him. The world always says the same thing, and in that patient truth which proceeds from star to star, is established a freedom that releases us from ourselves and from others, as in that other patient truth which proceeds from death to death. Patrice, Catherine, Rose, and Claire then grew aware of the happiness born of their abandonment to the world. If this night was in some sense the figure of their fate, they marveled that it should be at once so carnal and so secret, that upon its countenance mingled both tears and the sun, and with pain and joy, their hearts learned to hear that double lesson which leads to a happy death. It is late now, already midnight. On the brow of this night, which is like the repose and the reflection of the world, a dim surge and murmur of stars heralds the coming dawn. A tremulous light descends from the sky. Patrice looks at his friends. Catherine sitting on the parapet, her head tipped back. Rose huddled on the deck chair, her hands resting on Gula. Claire standing stiff against the parapet, her high, round forehead a white patch in the darkness. Young creatures capable of happiness, who exchange their youth and keep their secrets. He stands beside Catherine and stares over her glistening shoulder into the bowl of the sky. Rose comes over to the parapet, and all four are facing the world now. It is as if the suddenly cooler dew of the night were rinsing the signs of solitude from them, delivering them from themselves, and by that tremulous and fugitive baptism restoring them to the world. At this moment, when the night overflows with stars, their gestures are fixed against the great mute face of the sky. Patrice raises an arm toward the night, sweeping sheaves of stars in his gesture. The sea of the heavens stirred by his arm, and all Algiers at his feet, around them like a dark, glittering cape of jewels and shells.